It was supposed to be a moment of relief. Walking out of that hospital after days of recovery. I was still a little weak, holding the discharge papers in my hand, expecting to see my son Michael's car pull up any minute. Instead, my phone buzzed. It was a text message. Short, cold. A single line telling me to call an Uber because they were too busy to pick me up. No explanation. No apology, just a dismissal. As if I were an inconvenience instead of his own mother. I stood there in the sterile hallway, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air, and for a moment I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I wasn't dizzy from the surgery. It was the shock, the sting that cut deeper than any scalpel could. In that single message, years of unspoken truths hit me all at once. I wasn't a priority. I wasn't even considered worth the drive. I was a burden to my own son and his wife, Sarah. I thought about how often I had brushed off the little signs, how Sarah's polite smile never quite reached her eyes, how Michael always seemed distracted when I spoke, his gaze slipping back to his phone, how at family dinners I ended up on the far end of the table, listening instead of being listened to. I had told myself it was just modern life, everyone busy, everyone rushing, but standing there with that text glowing coldly on my screen, I could no longer excuse it. I was invisible to them, nothing more than background noise in the life I had once built for them brick by brick. Still, beneath the ache, there was something else, a simmering strength that hadn't yet died. I thought of all the sacrifices I had made to raise Michael, the nights I stayed awake helping with homework, the years I worked 2 jobs so he could have a better life. That love deserved more than to be cast aside with the flick of a thumb. As I walked slowly toward the exit, clutching my coat around me, the glass doors opened with a hiss, and the chill air of evening brushed against my face. That's when I noticed someone standing just outside, a man with silver at his temples, studying me as if he knew me. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, something that stirred an old memory I hadn't touched in decades. I tightened my grip on the discharge papers, my heart beating faster. I didn't yet know why he was there, but I could feel that this meeting was going to change everything. And that is where my story truly begins. 3 days before that cold text at the hospital doors, I was lying in a room that hummed with machines and smelled faintly of bleach and stale air. The nurses were kind, but kindness from strangers is different from love from family. Each time the door opened, I half expected to see Michael walk in with flowers, or Sarah bringing me a warm smile. Instead, it was always another nurse checking vitals, another aide adjusting the IV, another cart rattling past with trays of untouched meals. Those hours stretched long. I watched the clock tick past meals, past visiting hours, past the time when most people my age should be surrounded by children and grandchildren asking, "How are you feeling? Mom, do you need anything?" But the chair by my bed stayed empty. My phone stayed silent. The only sound was the steady beeping of the monitor, reminding me that my heart was still beating even if no one seemed to notice. As I lay there, memories crept in uninvited. I thought back to the years when Michael was little. I remembered sewing his Halloween costumes late into the night, even when I had to be up at 5:00 the next morning for work. I remembered packing his school lunches, slipping in little notes to remind him that I loved him. When he wanted to study architecture, I picked up extra shifts to help with tuition. When he and Sarah bought their first house, I quietly wrote the check for the down payment, even though it meant draining my own savings. Every sacrifice I made felt worth it, because it was for my son. But sitting in that bed, I realized how one-sided that love had become. Family dinners had slowly turned into me sitting at the far end of the table, nodding politely while they talked about their busy schedules. Holidays meant I was expected to cook, but rarely invited to share my stories. Even small things my opinions brushed aside. My presence tolerated more than cherished. I had excused it all as life moving too fast. But in that hospital room, excuses no longer comforted me. The truth pressed down heavier than the IV in my arm. I wasn't just overlooked, I was forgotten. Years of patience, of swallowing small hurts, suddenly tasted bitter. My sacrifices had become invisible, like water soaking into dry ground that never grew anything in return. The more I thought about it, the more a quiet anger replaced my sadness. By the time I was discharged, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't only healing from surgery, I was waking up. And soon, I would discover that neglect was only the beginning. Something far darker was waiting for me just beyond those hospital doors. When I stepped outside the hospital that evening, the man waiting near the entrance didn't just look at me, he studied me, like someone recognizing a face from a long-forgotten dream. At first, I thought maybe he was another patient's visitor. But then he spoke my name with a quiet certainty. That was how Robert entered back into my life. Though at that moment, I didn't realize just how deeply his presence would shake the ground beneath me. He told me he worked at the bank I had trusted for years, and there was something I needed to hear. My stomach tightened. I followed him into a quiet corner of the lobby, and as he explained, the words landed like blows. Michael had been meeting with bank officers for weeks, spinning stories about me. He painted me as frail, confused, unable to manage my own finances. He had said I was sliding into incompetence, that I required constant care, that he was the one paying my medical bills. What shattered me most was hearing how he backed up those lies with my own sacrifices. Those checks I had written to help him cover his mortgage, he had presented them as proof that I was financially dependent on him, not the other way around. He twisted my love into evidence of weakness. Then came the gut punch I had apparently co-signed that very mortgage years ago. My name attached to documents I had no memory of agreeing to. My signature was there, neat and familiar, but I could not recall ever holding a pen to those pages. I felt a wave of betrayal that left me cold. This was my son, the boy I raised, the boy I defended, the boy I believed would one day protect me. And instead, he had laid the groundwork to strip me of my independence and my dignity. I stood there, stunned, while Robert's words echoed in my ears. But then something unexpected broke through the storm of anger. As I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw something I hadn't seen in decades. His eyes were the same shade I remembered from summers long ago, when I was a young woman standing on the edge of love. Robert Hamilton. My heart stumbled as I realized why his voice had felt so familiar. He wasn't just a banker with bad news. He was Bobby, the boy I had once loved, the one I thought I had lost forever. The betrayal of my son was still burning hot in my chest, but beneath it, a bittersweet warmth stirred. Life had just handed me back a piece of my past I never expected to see again. And suddenly, I felt the pull of two storms colliding: the heartbreak of Michael's lies and the shock of standing face to face with my first love. When Robert said his name, it felt like time cracked open. and spilled memories across the floor. I hadn't heard Bobby in decades, yet in an instant, I was back at 17, standing on the porch with my heart pounding, believing in forever. Tears welled before I could stop them. It wasn't just the shock of seeing him, it was the realization of all the years stolen by lies, misunderstandings, and the choices of people who thought they knew what was best for me. We sat together in a quiet corner of the hospital cafe, two older souls carrying the weight of lost time. He spoke softly about the past, about how he had searched for me once, but life pulled us down separate roads. I thought of how my parents disapproved, how they insisted I needed someone more stable, someone who could take care of me. I thought of the day Bobby left town, how I convinced myself it was for the best, even as my heart splintered. Now, here he was, sitting across from me, silver hair catching the light, and yet his eyes hadn't changed. They still held that steady kindness I remembered from the boy who once walked me home under the summer stars. Regret ached in my chest, but it was softened by a strange comfort I hadn't imagined at all. That love had been real, and seeing him again reminded me of a part of myself I thought had long ago died. But Robert didn't let me stay lost in sentiment. He reminded me, gently but firmly, that Michael's actions weren't just careless mistakes. They were calculated lies, the kind that could strip me of my independence, my home, even my freedom. Hearing him speak with that certainty snapped something awake in me. I had spent too long excusing Michael's behavior, telling myself he was tired, stressed, or simply distracted. But this wasn't distraction. It was betrayal. As Robert reached for my hand, I felt the steadiness of his grip, and in that touch was a reminder that I wasn't powerless. I wasn't the frail, confused woman Michael painted me to be. I was still the same woman who had raised him, who had worked 2 jobs, who had survived heartbreak and loss. And now, with Robert beside me, I felt something stirring that I hadn't felt in years, resolve. I knew then that I could no longer let love blind me to the truth. I would stop making excuses. I would stop shrinking myself to keep the peace. If Michael wanted to treat me as if I were helpless, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The time had come to fight back, and this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. Once the initial shock of betrayal settled into my bones, it hardened into something else: determination. I wasn't going to sit quietly while my own son painted me as weak and helpless. If he thought I was too blind to see what he was doing, then he was about to discover just how wrong he was. Robert and I sat together late into the evening, piecing together the steps we needed to take. He had seen plenty of cases like this before: adult children manipulating paperwork, twisting narratives to take control of their parents' assets. But he told me something that stuck with me: arrogance always leaves cracks. And Michael's arrogance was a canyon. We decided to use his confidence against him. Michael had no reason to hide his lies anymore. He thought I was out of the picture, too confused to understand, too dependent to resist. That made him sloppy. Robert explained how Michael had been coming into the bank, spinning his story for the loan officers, dropping my name as if I were nothing more than a burden dragging him down. He leaned on my supposed incompetence to gain sympathy, to make himself look like the dutiful son carrying all the weight. I pictured him there, in his neatly pressed shirt and polished shoes, smiling that smooth smile he always put on when he wanted something. I could almost hear his voice, dripping with false concern, describing me as frail, unstable, a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own checkbook. Every word was a dagger, but instead of breaking me, it sharpened me. Robert suggested I confront him at the very place he felt most untouchable, the bank. It was risky, but it was the only way to catch him in his performance and tear down the mask in front of people who mattered. I imagined walking into that office, my son mid-sentence, expecting another nod of approval from the staff. And then, instead of approval, he would find me standing there, watching, listening, ready to speak the truth he had buried under paperwork and lies. As the plan formed, I felt my fear recede. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to Michael's choices, I was preparing my own. The thought of it sent a current through me, like a drumbeat in my chest. This wasn't just about proving him wrong, it was about reclaiming my voice. By the next morning, everything was set. I knew where he would be and when. The anticipation built with every tick of the clock. Soon, Michael would see that the woman he dismissed as invisible was not only watching, but ready to strike. The next morning, I walked into the bank with my heart pounding like a drum. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind all night, yet nothing could fully prepare me for seeing Michael sitting there so smug, spinning his story. He was leaning across the desk with that polished smile, describing me as if I were a shadow of myself, confused, helpless, a burden. The loan officer nodded politely, jotting down notes, and for a brief second, I watched from the doorway, letting his arrogance hang in the air. Then I stepped inside. His head snapped around, and the color drained from his face. He hadn't expected me. He thought I'd be at home, tucked away, too feeble to notice what he was doing. The silence that followed was sharp, the kind that makes every breath sound loud. I felt steady, almost calm. I walked to the center of the room, placed my bag down, and looked him squarely in the eyes. In that moment, I wasn't the mother who always made excuses for him. I wasn't the woman he had painted as frail and incompetent. I was the woman who had raised him, who had worked endless hours, who had poured everything into giving him a life he clearly didn't value. I began speaking, not to him, but to the people in that room. I told them how I had spent years saving money, how I had written checks to help Michael with his home, believing it was an act of love. I described how those same checks had been twisted into false evidence that I was dependent, that I was incapable. I explained that my supposed incompetence was nothing more than a fabrication meant to strip me of dignity and give him control. Robert stepped forward then, placing the documents on the desk, the records of payments, the forged explanations, the signatures attached to a mortgage I never knowingly agreed to. The weight of truth sat heavy on the table, undeniable. The loan officer looked from me to Michael, his expression shifting from polite interest to quiet alarm. And then, I let my voice break just enough to show the years of hurt. I told Michael that I remembered every sacrifice the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the clothes I patched so he wouldn't be embarrassed at school, the long hours I worked so he could pursue his dreams. And yet, standing in front of him now, all of it felt like it had been thrown back in my face. He hadn't just betrayed my trust. He had betrayed the very foundation of love between a mother and her child. The room was silent when I finished. Michael tried to speak, to smooth it over as he always did, but his words crumbled under the weight of the evidence. everyone could see the truth now. For once, his charm couldn't save him. As I stood there, I felt something inside me settle. Justice wasn't fully served yet, but the mask had been torn away. My son's lies were no longer hidden. The next steps would be painful, but at least the world finally saw him for who he really was. And that was the beginning of the aftermath I knew I would have to face. When the dust settled after that day at the bank, the silence in my life felt heavier than ever. Michael couldn't talk his way out of the evidence laid before him. The bank launched a full investigation, and his carefully constructed story unraveled piece by piece. What he thought was clever manipulation turned into a clear case of fraud. His reputation, the one he had spent years polishing, began to crack under the weight of the truth. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, never once defended me. She didn't accuse me either. She just stayed silent, her eyes down, as though pretending not to see would protect her from the mess her husband had created. That silence cut nearly as deep as Michael's betrayal. Sometimes it isn't only the lies that hurt, it's the people who choose to look away when they know better. Her weakness showed me something I hadn't wanted to admit. Love without courage is no love at all. In the quiet after, I found myself grieving, not just for my son, but for the years I had spent believing that blood alone would bind us together. I thought of the little boy I once held in my arms, the child who used to reach for my hand in crowded places, the teenager who once promised he'd take care of me when I grew old. Somewhere along the way, that boy was lost, replaced by a man who saw me as an obstacle instead of a blessing. The heartbreak of that truth nearly broke me. But life has a strange way of giving back when you least expect it. Robert stood by me through it all. His presence reminded me that not every bond fades, and some connections, even the ones you thought were gone, can return to give you strength. With him, I felt a steadiness, a quiet reassurance that I wasn't facing this storm alone. He looked at me not as a burden, not as someone fading, but as a woman still strong, still capable, still worthy of love. And so, from the ashes of betrayal came something I never thought I'd find again: hope. A reminder that family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by loyalty, by respect, by the willingness to stand beside someone when it isn't easy. I had spent years excusing neglect because of shared DNA. But now I understood family is chosen every single day in the way we treat each other. To anyone listening, I hope my story reminds you to guard your dignity fiercely, to never let even those closest to you convince you that you deserve less than love and respect. Blood may connect us, but it's kindness and loyalty that truly make us family. If my story touched you, I'd love to hear yours. Share it in the comments below, because your voice matters too. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help me keep shining a light on the truth.